My name is Sera Voss. I'm 32 years old. And the Sunday evening my mother set down her fork at the dinner table and said, in front of my father, my uncle, and my grandmother, "Your father worked 30 years in a real job. This isn't real," was the evening I finally understood that some people can only measure what they can already see. My uncle laughed once, a short sound through his nose. My father nodded, not looking at me. My grandmother turned her water glass a quarter turn and said nothing. I picked up my own glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down on the ring it had left on the placemat. I did not explain myself. I did not reach for the counter-argument I had ready in my back pocket, the one about active users and month-over-month growth, and the email sitting in my inbox from a product lead at a company whose name would have made the table go quiet. What none of them knew, what I had not told anyone outside my two co-founders and my attorney, was that the term sheet had been on my lawyer's desk for 11 days. The number on it was real. The acquiring company was real. And by the following Friday, the story would run on every major technology publication in the country. I finished my dinner. I helped clear the plates. I drove home alone. I want to give you the full picture, because the dinner table scene doesn't make sense without it, and neither does anything that came after. I grew up in Millhaven, a mid-sized city in the mid-Atlantic region where my father, Douglas Voss, had spent his entire professional life working as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company. 31 years, same building, same parking space by the end. He was not a man who distrusted effort. He was a man who distrusted invisible effort, work that didn't produce a legible output, a check stub, a title on a business card that anyone could read and immediately understand. He respected what he could verify. This was not cruelty. It was the operating system he had been handed by his own father, who had worked a union job for 38 years and considered anything you couldn't clock in and out of to be closer to gambling than employment. My mother, Christine, was more verbal about it but not more certain. She had a bachelor's degree in education, had taught third grade for 11 years, and had left teaching when I was born to manage the household and, eventually, to work part-time as an administrative assistant at a dental practice. She understood, in a way my father didn't, that a degree was supposed to unlock something. What she couldn't accept was that the thing mine had unlocked looked, from the outside, exactly like someone sitting alone in a room staring at a laptop. The gap between what I was doing and what she could see me doing was, for her, the entirety of the problem. My Uncle Gregor was my father's younger brother. He had opinions about most things and delivered them at a volume calibrated for a larger room. He had worked in commercial real estate for 20 years and had a salesman's instinct for finding the softest point in any position and applying pressure there. He was not malicious. He was, in his own estimation, helping. The help took the form of statistics I hadn't asked for and comparisons I hadn't invited, delivered at every family gathering with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything he'd said out loud. The company, the thing on my laptop, the invisible effort, was called Lumen. I had started it at 25, 1 year out of university, where I had studied computer science on a partial scholarship that I had supplemented with a part-time job at the campus IT help desk for 3 years. The idea was not complicated to explain, though it was complicated to build. Lumen was a mobile productivity application designed for people who manage their work lives primarily on their phones rather than on desktops. In 2018, when I started, this was a significant and underserved population: gig workers, tradespeople, small business owners, anyone whose office was wherever they were standing. The app organized tasks, tracked billable hours, generated invoices, and communicated with basic accounting software, and it did all of this without requiring the user to understand accounting software. It assumed nothing except that the person using it was busy and had a phone. My two co-founders were a woman named Dara Obi, who had been my roommate for 2 years at university and whose design instincts were the reason Lumen looked the way it looked, and a man named Joel Santerre, who had worked in mobile development at a mid-sized tech firm for 4 years before we pulled him into this, and who was the reason the thing worked at all. The three of us had pooled $34,000. My share was $11,000, the remainder of a savings account I had been building since my first part-time job at 16, and we had spent the first 8 months building the product before we launched anything. I had not told my parents the amount. I had learned early that dollar figures produced a particular kind of conversation, One that ended with my father saying that's a significant risk and my mother saying, is there any way to get that money back? And I did not have the bandwidth for that conversation while also building a product. So I told him I was working on an app with 2 colleagues. My father asked if I was being paid for it. I said not yet. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he had already decided something and was simply waiting for the evidence to confirm it. The first year was the year I learned what it meant to build something from below zero. We launched Lumen in March of my 26th year with 3,000 beta users we had recruited through forums, community groups, and a series of conversations Dara had conducted on social media with freelancers and independent contractors who kept saying, in various forms, that they needed exactly what we were building. The launch went well by the standards we had set for ourselves, which were modest because we understood that a launch going well and a company being viable were 2 different things. By December of that year, we had 22,000 active users and $67,000 in annual recurring revenue. This was not, by any measure, a salary for 3 people. Joel was still taking occasional freelance development contracts to cover his rent. Dara was selling design assets on a digital marketplace on weekends. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment that cost $890 a month and eating the same 4 meals in rotation because they were cheap, and I already knew the quantities by memory. My parents knew none of this. I visited home 4 times that year, and I ate the food my mother made, and I answered questions about how things were going with the same answer, steadily, which was both true and sufficient. I was not lying. I was selecting. I had learned, through a series of conversations in my early and mid-20s, that the full accounting of what I was doing produced more concern than I could manage alongside the actual doing of it. Year 2. $312,000 in annual recurring revenue. We raised a seed round, $1.8 million from 2 early-stage investors, a firm called Groundline Ventures whose lead partner, a woman named Alicia Tran, had been following our metrics for 6 months before she called, and an angel investor named Bernard Chu, who had built and sold a logistics software company and who understood, without needing it explained, what we were doing and why it would work. We hired 4 people. We moved out of the shared workspace we had been operating from and into a small dedicated office on the 4th floor of a building in the city's tech corridor. I told my parents about the fundraise. I said we had raised capital from investors and were hiring. My father asked if that meant I was now an employee of the investors. I explained that it didn't work that way, that the investment gave us runway to grow the product, that Dara and Joel and I retained ownership, that the investors received equity in exchange. He listened to this explanation with the expression he reserved for instructions on appliances he had not chosen to buy. My mother said, "So you still don't have a regular salary?" I said that was correct for now. She passed me the bread. The dinner table Sunday was in my 4th year. The one with the fork. The one with Uncle Gregor and his odds. By that Sunday, Lumen had 2.3 million active users. We had raised a Series A, $7.4 million, led by a firm called Crest Capital whose managing partner, a man named Owen Briggs, had reached out to us after seeing our retention metrics in an industry report. We had 17 full-time employees. We had integrations with 4 major accounting platforms. We had been covered twice in trade publications and once in a regional business journal. I had a salary, $94,000 a year, which I had set deliberately below what the funding would have supported because I believed, and Dara agreed, that cash in the company was more valuable than cash in my pocket at this stage of the arc. My father did not know any of this in specific. He knew I was still working on the app. He knew I had not taken a traditional job. He knew that when people asked him what his daughter did for work, he had to say, "She does something with software," and leave the room with a sensation that he had not fully answered the question. This was, I understood eventually, a portion of what drove the fork moment.
It was not entirely about me.
It was about a conversation he had not been able to have, about a daughter he could not describe to the people in his life in the language they shared. I understood this. I picked up my glass. I drove home. The term sheet arrived in a formal email 11 days before the Sunday dinner from the legal team of a technology company I will call by its public name here, Meridian Systems. Meridian was a mid-market enterprise software company that had spent 4 years building out a suite of tools for small business owners and independent contractors. Lumen was the piece they were missing, the mobile-first, consumer-facing layer that their own product roadmap had repeatedly failed to build internally. Their head of corporate development, a man named Patrick Weller, had first contacted our attorney, a woman named Simona Chaby, who had been with us since the seed round, 8 weeks earlier. There had been 3 calls, 2 in-person meetings at a neutral office in the city, and a due diligence process that had required me to produce documentation I had been maintaining since year 1 specifically because I had always understood that a clean data room was the difference between a deal that closed and a deal that didn't. The number on the term sheet was $6.3 million for a controlling acquisition. Meridian would acquire 73% of Lumen's equity, with Dara, Joel, and I retaining the remainder and continuing to lead the product under a 3-year employment agreement. The number was not the largest acquisition in the industry that year. It was not a number that would appear in a headline designed to produce maximum impact. It was, however, a real number attached to a real document, and when Simona Chaby sent it to me, I read it 3 times and then closed my laptop and walked around my apartment for approximately 4 minutes before I sat back down and wrote her a reply. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell my uncle. I did not post anything. The due diligence period was ongoing and the confidentiality provisions in the term sheet were explicit, and I was not someone who had ever struggled to keep my own information close. I had been doing it for 7 years. The acquisition was announced on a Friday. The press release went out at 7 in the morning, Eastern Time, through Meridian's communications team. It named Lumen, named the 3 founders, described the product, and included a quote from Patrick Weller about the strategic rationale and a quote from me about the team's mission. By 7:45, the story had been picked up by 4 technology publications. By 9, it was in 2 national business outlets. By 10:30, it had been shared approximately 11,000 times across platforms. I was in my apartment when it went live. I had been awake since 5:30. I had made coffee and I had sat at my kitchen table and I had read the press release one more time, the final version, the one that was now public and no longer mine to hold. Then I put my phone face down and finished my coffee. My phone rang at 7:53. It was not my parents. It was Dara, whose voice had a quality I had not heard from her before, high and slightly unsteady, like a wire pulled tight. She said, "It's everywhere." I said, "I know." She said, "Joel is crying." I said, "Tell him to drink some water." She laughed, which released something in the line between us. We talked for 6 minutes. At 8:11 my phone rang again. It was my father. I want to tell you exactly what that call was because I think it matters. My father called at 8:11 in the morning. I know the time because I looked at my phone before I answered, the way you do when you already know who it is and you need a moment to decide who you're going to be when you pick up. I answered on the 3rd ring. He said, "I saw something online." His voice had the particular quality it had when he was navigating unfamiliar terrain. Careful, like he was watching where he put his feet. He said, "About your company." I said, "Yes." He said, "Meridian." He said it like he was confirming that he had read the word correctly. I said, "That's right." There was a pause that lasted long enough for me to hear him breathing. Then he said, "That's," and he stopped. He started again. "That's significant, Sera." I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "I didn't," and stopped again. Then he said, "I didn't understand what you were building." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have." I said, "You did the best you could with what you could see." There was another pause. He said, "Your grandmother called me already." I said, "Of course she did." And he made a sound that I recognized after 32 years, as the sound he made when he was not going to cry but was deciding, actively, not to. We talked for 14 minutes. He asked questions, real questions, the kind that required him to understand the answers, not the kind designed to poke holes. He asked what a controlling acquisition meant for my role. He asked whether I would stay with the company. He asked about Dara and Joel. He asked, at one point, whether the 3 of us had celebrated yet. I said we were going to dinner that night. He said, "Good." He said, "You should." We said goodbye. My mother called 12 minutes later. Her call was shorter and louder, and she said, "I always knew you would figure it out," in a way that I received without comment, because the version of that sentence that was true was more complicated than the moment required, and I had stopped needing to correct the record on that particular point some years earlier. My Uncle Gregor texted at 9:47. The text said, "Saw the news. Big deal.
Congrats."
No punctuation after congrats. I read it, put my phone in my jacket pocket, and walked to the coffee shop on the corner of my block where I had been going every morning for 3 years. I ordered the same thing I always ordered. I sat at the same table by the window. I opened my laptop and I had 17 unread emails, and I started from the top. The calls and messages continued for 4 days. 43 in total, from family members, former classmates, a high school teacher who had somehow found my contact information, 2 people I had not spoken to in years who sent messages that began with "I always believed in you," and whom I could not specifically remember believing in me at any point I could identify. I responded to each one. I was brief and warm, and I did not say anything I did not mean. I did not say "I told you so" in any form, including the subtle forms that require no words. My aunt on my mother's side, a woman named Renata, who had said, at a family gathering 3 years earlier, that she worried about me, going it alone, and that perhaps I should consider a more traditional path while I was still young enough to change direction, sent a card through the mail. It arrived 6 days after the announcement. The card had a generic congratulatory design on the front. Inside, in her handwriting, she had written, "We are all so proud. This is wonderful news. Please let us know if there is anything we can do to support you going forward." I put the card on my kitchen counter. I looked at it for a moment. Then I put it in the drawer where I kept things I was not ready to discard. The thing about an offer to support that arrives after the need is past is that it is still a real offer from a person who means it, and I have tried to hold it in that register. What it is not, and what I stopped needing it to be, is the thing that was missing when I needed it. I was 25 years old in a 1-bedroom apartment eating the same 4 meals because I had invested my savings in a company I was not certain would survive, and the people who loved me most were building a case for why I should stop. I understood their reasoning. I also understood that I could not afford to share it. Simona Chaby and I spoke the week after the announcement closed. The acquisition paperwork was in its final stage. The Meridian employment agreements were drafted, and I had reviewed them once myself and twice with Simone. The transition timeline had been set. Dara, Joel, and I would formally join Meridian's product organization effective the 1st of the following month, with Lumen operating as a semi-autonomous unit within the larger structure. Patrick Weller, to his credit, had been specific about preserving the product culture. He had said in the first meeting, and repeated it without being asked, that the reason Meridian wanted Lumen was because of what it was, not what it could be converted into, and that he understood the difference between those two things was the people who had built it. I believed him. I had done enough research on Meridian's previous acquisitions to have a basis for that belief rather than simply a hope. The formal signing took place on a Tuesday afternoon at Simona Chaby's office on the 14th floor of a building downtown. Patrick Weller was there with 2 members of his legal team. Dara sat to my left. Joel sat to her left. The room had a long conference table and a view of the city that I found myself looking at while the documents were being organized, and I thought about the shared workspace where we had built the first version of Lumen, which had been on the 3rd floor of a building 12 blocks from this one, and which had a view of a parking structure and a sandwich shop that we had eaten at so often that the owner eventually learned our orders. I signed where Simone indicated. I signed 11 pages. On the last page, I set the pen down, and Dara put her hand briefly on the table between us, palm down, and I put mine next to hers for a moment, and that was the full extent of the ceremony between us, because we had known each other long enough that we did not need more than that. Patrick Weller shook our hands. His grip was firm without being performative. He said, "We're glad you're here." I said, "So are we." We drove back to the office. We had a team meeting that afternoon to walk our 17 employees through what the acquisition meant for their roles, their benefits, their day-to-day. I had prepared notes. I did not use them. I talked for 22 minutes and answered every question that came up, and the questions that came up were good ones, the kind that told me our team had been paying attention for a long time. After the meeting, I stayed at my desk until 7 in the evening. I was working on the product roadmap for the first joint quarter under Meridian, which Patrick's team needed by end of the following week. It was the same work I had been doing for 7 years. The desk was different. The view was different. The work was the same. There is a particular shape to the years between 25 and 32 when you are building something no one else can see yet. The shape is not dramatic. It does not have a moment you can point to and say, "Here, this is where it turned." It is made of smaller things: a 3,000-person beta launch on a Tuesday, a $67,000 revenue year that you can't explain to your parents in a way that lands, a Sunday dinner where someone sets down a fork and tells you what you're building isn't real. It is made of the 4 meals you rotate because you know the quantities by heart and you need the rest of your cognitive bandwidth for the problem in front of you. It is made of 14-minute phone calls on a Friday morning with a father who says, quietly, that he didn't understand what you were building and that he should have. I have thought about that phone call more than I have thought about the signing. I think that's probably the right order. Lumen now runs on, as of the last count my product analytics team pulled, which was a Thursday morning 2 weeks ago, just over 40 million devices. The number is still abstract to me in the way that large numbers become abstract when you have been watching a smaller number grow for long enough that the large number arrives without the ceremony you imagined it would have. 40 million people are using a tool that Dara designed and Joel built, and I spent 7 years selling in one form or another to everyone who needed convincing: investors, users, a family at a dinner table in Millhaven. My father downloaded the app 3 weeks after the acquisition. He called me to ask how to set it up. I walked him through it on the phone. He uses it now to track the list of home maintenance tasks he has been managing since he retired: the gutters, the furnace filter, the inspection on the car. He sends me screenshots occasionally, which is the closest he comes to saying something he doesn't have the language for. I keep them. My mother told her book club about the acquisition. She told me this herself, somewhat sheepishly, about a month after it happened. She said they had asked a lot of questions she couldn't answer, and she had wished she knew more about what I had actually built. I offered to walk her through it on video call. We spent 45 minutes on a Sunday afternoon going through the app together, with her on her tablet and me on my phone, and I showed her every feature and explained who used it and why. She asked good questions. At one point she said, "I should have asked you these questions years ago." I said, "You're asking them now." She said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "No, but it's something." Uncle Gregor has not mentioned the odds since the announcement. I have not raised the subject. There is something I want to say about the space between being doubted and being vindicated, because I think that space is where most people actually live, in the middle of it, not at either end. The doubt my family expressed was not wrong in its premise. Building a company from nothing, with personal savings, on an idea that produces no legible output for years, is a genuinely risky thing to do. The statistics they cited were not invented. Most startups fail. Most apps fail. The version of me who is sitting at that dinner table in year 4 was, by the numbers, more likely to confirm their fears than to disprove them. What they could not see, and what I could not show them because it had no visible form yet, was that I had already priced the risk. I had looked at it directly, in the specific language of a capitalization table and a product roadmap and a retention curve, and I had decided that the probability of success was high enough to justify the cost of failure. This was not optimism. It was arithmetic. And the arithmetic was built on information they didn't have access to because I had not given it to them, partly because I didn't think they would know what to do with it, and partly because giving it to them would have required me to be in 2 conversations at once when I could only afford to be in one. I am not certain they would have believed me anyway. I think the belief that arrived on a Friday morning in the form of a press release was, for some of them, the first form of evidence they were equipped to receive. That is not a condemnation. It is a fact about the limits of what we can see from where we are standing. The work was the same work whether they believed in it or not. The 40 million users are the same users. The 4 meals I rotated in that 1-bedroom apartment are the same 4 meals. The thing I built is the thing I built, and it is the same thing it always was, and the validation that arrived after it was visible to everyone is not the same as the faith that would have been there when it wasn't. I have received the late version graciously. I do not mistake it for the early version. The early version I found elsewhere, in Dara's design instincts and Joel's refusal to ship anything broken, and Alicia Tran's 6 months of quiet attention before she called. In every user who sent a message that said the app had changed how they ran their business. In every morning I sat at the coffee shop table by the window and opened my laptop and started from the top. The proof did not make me write. The work made me write. The proof just made it legible. If you have spent time inside something you couldn't yet show anyone, if you have sat at a table and absorbed the doubt without flinching and driven home alone and gone back to the work the next morning, I want you to know that the work was not wasted. Not 1 hour of it. Not one rotation of the 4 meals. What you build while no one is watching is still what you build. Keep going. The arithmetic will show its work eventually. Before I go, I want to ask you something because I have found over the years that this community holds the most specific and honest answers to the questions I don't know how to ask myself. There was a moment in this story, a Friday morning, 7:53, the phone ringing in a quiet apartment, when the proof finally arrived in a form that the people who had doubted me could understand. But by then, I had already stopped needing it the way I once had. Has that happened to you? Was there a specific moment, a particular phone call, a message, a room you were in, when the validation you had spent years waiting for finally arrived, and you realized it had arrived about 3 years too late to feel the way you'd imagined it would? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. New stories go up every week. And if you know someone sitting in the middle of it right now, in the years before the proof, share this with them. I'll see you in the next one. This is an original fictional story created for entertainment purposes only. All names, characters, events, and details are invented. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is entirely coincidental.